upload your photo or your video into the Texas Master Naturalist website. That's txmn.org. And some of you, we would like you to enter. And you know who you are. Come on in, come on in. Hi, you'll just sign in and we'll find you a seat. That's Zach Chapman. He's on Facebook. If you don't know him and you want to see wonderful photos of bugs, frogs, snakes, slime mold. My new favorite slime mold is the dog vomit slime mold. So yeah, Mary Beth is going to introduce our speaker, and this is not promotion from CTMN. Well,
I'm unabashedly full. Yes. Oh, yes. This book is written by Amy Martin, and she's a member of the North Texas chapter? Incredibly talented person and talented writer. I started reading this. It's called Wild DFW, Explore the Amazing Nature in and around Dallas-Fort Worth. I started reading it, and have you ever heard the expression, you could just eat it with a spoon? It's so good. And she writes like that. She's just the most magical writer. And she will be at a local bookstore Wednesday at 2. And I hope some of y'all will join me there to see Amy. She's going to be at the Monkey and Dog bookstore, but you do not have to own a monkey or a dog to go. Although I might pick up a monkey on the way. And it's on 7th Street, 2 o'clock Wednesday, Monkey and Dog. How can you forget the name of that? Oh. August 2nd, Funky Picnic. And, oh my gosh, that is such a good place. Good food. Funky Picnic, August 2nd, Funky Picnic, Amy Martin. What time? 5 o'clock. Oh, it is the official? Well, yeah, you can't really party at a bookstore much, can you? Oh, and Zach Chapman has 5 photos in here. Okay, next slide. Oh, can you go to the next slide? Oh, it is. Sorry. Here we go. Oh, thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. We are so pleased to have Dr. Aulicky here tonight. She works for the Native Prairie Association of Texas and talk about a well-rounded education. She grew up in New Jersey. She received her bachelor's. I'm going to start at the oldest one. Her bachelor's in ecology and natural resources from Rutgers. And that is in what? It's where? In New Jersey. She went to A&M. Yeah, you can feel sorry for me, especially football. They're changing to pickleball. So she has her master's in ecology from the University of Glasgow, Scotland. And she studied tropical birds. And I asked her, how many tropical birds are there in Scotland? But she did spend a lot of time in Ecuador. What a cool place to visit, and you know, a well-rounded education. And then she has her PhD. Is it a PhD in from Kansas State University from 2020, and she researched the lesser prairie chickens. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. She monitors and manages the Native Prairie Association of Texas Prairies, holds educational workshops, and acts as a spokesperson for conservation of native prairies. And her official title is North Texas Director of Outreach and Stewardship for NPAT. And she's going to talk about pockets and remnants saving Texas prairies.
Once I find my mouse, will be off. Let's see. There's that one, and there's that one. Aha, okay. That screen. Okay. Let me know if I need to. Oh no. I love technology, says the millennial. Can everyone hear me okay? And I'll make sure that Zoom can hear me okay.
They just need to see it.
Let's see. Is it not shared? Okay. Do. Okay. Share. Okay, let me hide my notes. Which say really helpful things like, hello, my name is. I'm afraid it's not very exciting. Everything good to go? Okay, awesome. So after that lovely introduction, I feel like I really don't need to introduce myself all that much or my topic as much, but I will a little bit anyway. So as was mentioned, I have a background in avian ecology, so I followed birds throughout the world and ended up falling in love with prairies through lesser prairie chickens. If anyone has conversations about that evolutionary left turn, which is my favorite bird in the entire world, please feel free to ask me afterwards. But today we're focusing on the ecosystem that they depend on today, prairies. My role at MPAT is focused in North Texas, and I will say very warmly that North has a lot of stretch and elasticity to it, because that means some days I am as far east as Texarkana, as far west as Colorado City, and sometimes as far south as Austin. So it really depends on where the need is, where North Texas ends up being applied. And it means a lot of really bad car karaoke. So thankfully, I'm usually driving by myself. In my role, I'm primarily concerned with the conservation of prairies throughout the state, primarily private lands, and I'll talk about what that looks like. I also do a significant amount of outreach, so that means I get to come speak to lovely folks such as yourselves, some strangers in the room, some very familiar and very friendly faces. I also am lucky enough that I get to continue to do some research as well. So I help monitor the vegetation as well as the bird life that we have on impact properties. And I also solicit outside researchers as well in my role. Let me see if I can drag that off real. Hopefully that's a little bit better. Okay, so today's star of the show is absolutely not me, but prairies. And if you are not a hardcore, passionate prairie person, I hope by the end of my talk, I'll have knocked you a couple degrees in what I think is the right direction. And hopefully you'll all agree with me by the time you leave. Prairies are an amazing ecosystem. They are completely dependent on disturbance to maintain what you see in this photo here, which is predominantly grass with this really rich understory beneath it. It's typically free of woodies. So I'm talking about shrubs and trees. So historically for prairie systems, they would have been restricted mostly to areas where there would have been water to support that. And they would have been nice and open. One of my other favorite things about prairie ecosystems is they're relatively young as far as ecosystems go. So we're talking about 8,000 to 10,000 years old, give or take, which means as long as there have been people in North America, there have been people on prairies, influencing prairie ecosystems and also being involved in the way prairies are managed, which is really, really cool and very unique in terms of ecosystems. And when I mean disturbance dependent, this is what I'm talking about. So if we want to see prairies on the landscape, we're really catching them at a certain specific point in succession. So ecological succession, in this case, I'm talking about secondary succession. So some event happens and the plant community comes back. If we're to do absolutely nothing and just watch what happens over the course of many, many, many years, what's going to happen is eventually that climax community is going to stop in some sort of woodland community. That's where it's stable. Prairies, you'll notice, fall right in this happy midpoint right before we get a lot of woody species. They have to be constantly pushed back through disturbance to keep them grassland dominated and to keep them open. And historically, there was really two big factors that did that. The first is fire. So for tallgrass prairie ecosystems like we're in today, historically estimates are about every 3 to 5 years they would have burned. And I'm not just talking about lightning strikes, though that absolutely did cause some wildfires, but I'm primarily talking about intentional prescribed burns. And part of the reason intentionally the prairies were burned was to move along your grazers to where you would want them, which is your other big disturbance force historically for prairie systems. I really hope folks in this room have been lucky enough to actually get to see bison reasonably close, because they're bison, either at Fort Worth Nature Center or in one of the other herds. So you can get a sense of how absolutely immense bison are. Because until you see one, it's really hard to wrap your head around. And once you see one, it's even harder to wrap your head around the idea that there was an estimated 30 to 60 million roaming the plains at one point in time, because that is immense. They would have been an incredible destructive force, turning over soil, eating selectively, bumping into stuff, creating wallows. And part of that helps keep prairies open and predominantly tree-free. And here in Texas, we are incredibly lucky. And no, it's not just because we live in the state of Texas. It is because we can take the most epic grassland road trip anywhere in the US, as far as I'm concerned. Because you can start off in the east, work your way through tallgrass prairie into mixed grass prairie, head over to shortgrass prairie into lesser prairie chicken territory, and then end up in the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands, all without leaving the state. And if I had it my way, it would be on all the Visit Texas brochures, would be this really windy way to work your way through the state and see the best parts of our native ecosystem. And in fact, historically and still ecologically, 2/3 of the state of Texas are prairie systems. So we're talking about an incredible amount of grasslands in the state. And when we talk about all that grasslands, we also have to talk about the unique diversity that we have. So just in Texas, there's an estimate between 5,000 to 6,000 different species of plants that are native to Texas. When we're talking about 2/3 of the state being prairie systems, we're talking about a lot of really cool, unique grassland species, some of which are specialists, some of which are only found in Texas. And whenever you have such a tremendous wealth of plant life, you end up with an incredible amount of biodiversity that is dependent on that plant life and is supported by that plant life. Which is why you get so many cool, unique grassland obligate species throughout the state and in prairie systems. I did my prairie work before this in Kansas. So when I came down here and folks told me that there were prairie crawfish, I was very confused, and I'm super into it now. Absolutely. Let's see if it will slide for me. Thank you. Okay. So I was super surprised about that. I was also not expecting the prairies to be as wet as they were. So I had a lot of learning curves to do in certain parts of Texas. But with such tremendous plant life, you have such tremendous biodiversity. It's a really fun place to work. And the prairies here are really unique in part because of it. And having worked both in the tropics and in prairie systems, I can absolutely tell you that if you're in certain parts of the tropics and you drop a square meter, and you're in Texas prairie and you drop a square meter, you're very likely to find more species in the square meter here than in some parts of the tropics. One thing works, one thing does not. Okay. So in addition to biodiversity of plants and animals, we also have really cool diversity in systems in prairies. So in North Texas, particularly in areas that MPAT is active, one unique ecosystem we have is the Sylvius dropseed prairie. So Sylvius dropseed prairies are named for the Sylvius dropseed grass, which on its own might look fairly unremarkable, but it's a really good indicator species that you're in a unique and really cool type of plant community. It's only found in an itty bitty pocket of Northeast Texas within the state, a couple of other areas in Oklahoma, Arkansas, but very, very minimal. And on Sylvius dropseed prairies, you can find everything from wild quinine to actually sundews, which is really, really cool. And we're lucky enough to actually have found sundews beneath Mima Mountain. So if you haven't seen a Mima Mount, it is a hill in miniature, typically with sandy surface that has just enough of a gradation and how that moisture moves that you do end up with unique plant communities that support cool things like sundews at the bottom in places you wouldn't necessarily expect them. And they are by far my favorite soil mystery because we're still not entirely sure how they form. And the best perhaps hypothesis I've heard is ancient pocket gophers. Mostly just because I love the idea of there being ancient pocket gophers that just roam their way from Northeast Texas down to coastal prairie and just left giant random mounds everywhere they went. Unfortunately, I don't think it's really well substantiated, but I'm holding out hope that that's going to be right. Another unique system that we're really lucky to have here in the state is Blackland Prairie. This is where I wasn't expecting to end up to my ankles in some water next to some crayfish, because it is an incredibly wet system. It also has really dark, thick clay soil, so a lot of local folks will call it black gumbo. And it has my other favorite soil feature, which are gilgai. So gilgai are small ephemeral ponds. If I'm lucky and I time it just right on some of MPAT's Blackland prairies, I will find them filled with water. It's usually only, if I'm lucky and it's a wet year, maybe about 2 months out of the year, they'll actually be filled with water. And they form because clay does what clay does. So it dries out and it cracks, and then water comes in, works into the cracks, presses on that clay, pushes it out, and over time, you end up with a surface that kind of feels like you're walking on the surface of the moon. Very curvaceous, up and down, supporting really cool communities, all very, very happy to have wet feet, and with a lot of cool stuff like crayfish and crayfish frogs and crayfish snakes. And I would be remiss in Fort Worth to not also acknowledge how awesome the cross timbers is. And I've been fortunate enough to actually see it in 3 different states. So this photo is actually from the little itty bitty bit of the cross timbers that crosses into Kansas. I miss trees, oddly enough, after being in Kansas for a long time. So I went in search of fall foliage here, down in the cross timbers. And cross timbers are savanna, predominantly by nature. So you will see post oak and blackjack oaks mostly throughout. Typically sandier soil. So if you've been lucky enough to go out into LBJ and you're wondering why all of the trails are sandy, it's supposed to be that way. But what's cool about Texas is this injection of limestone that's just gonna cut its way right into the middle of the cross timbers and produce these really unique plant communities that like really shallow limestone soil. Some of which are my favorites, like white rosin weed, which I was lucky enough to find out in the wild. And because of that limestone, you actually end up with open plains. So you get happy to have trees, savanna, plains. Really cool feature of this area of Texas. But I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the history of prairies in Texas as well. So one thing I'm just going to draw to your attention right away is from here to here, we're talking about roughly 100 years, give or take. In that time frame between settlement in more or less 1820, between 1930, it's estimated that we lost at least 80% of the Blackland Prairie in Texas, primarily to conversion to cotton, because in the 1860s, cotton was one of the largest exports that we had, and Dallas actually had one of the largest cotton markets, which went hand in hand also with the development of the railroad, which made it a lot easier to move product. So unfortunately, by the 1930s, we lost most of the Blackland to row crop agriculture, and that spread out into parts of the cross timbers as well. Unfortunately, now in Texas, whether we're talking coastal prairie or we're talking Blackland, there's less than 1% remaining in the state of Texas. And for most of it, at least in Blackland, we're talking within the span of a single person's lifetime. Unfortunately, Texas isn't unique in that regard. When we're talking about grassland systems throughout the world, it is the most endangered terrestrial biome that we have. So that's true for any continent that we have grassland systems, unfortunately. But it is considered to be in the most threat in North America between Canada, the US, and Mexico. So when we look at what's left of America's grasslands, these are the best estimates that I can find. So as we follow tallgrass prairie here on the right-hand side, the best estimates are 4% of that remaining tract remaining, with less than 1% of that of Texas's tallgrass prairie remaining. By the time we start moving further west into mixed grass prairie, we have an estimated 20% remaining. By the time we hit short grass and Chihuahuan desert grasslands, we're looking at estimates of 50%. And honestly, I think those last two estimates are too high just because there's not as much information easily available about them. And I don't know how much recent research is accounting for center pivot irrigation, having a significant influence in those regions as well. But the common denomination for what happened in prairie history, it was all driven by precipitation. Tallgrass prairie ended up going under the plow because it is in an area that gets more rainfall and has great soils. So when you put the two together, you get a really high demand to use it for agriculture. As you move further and further west and it dries up, more folks tend to want to run cattle or do things that are a little bit more gentle to their grasslands. These days, in my current role, I'm not very worried about prairie getting converted to row crop agriculture anymore. I'm instead worried about urban sprawl and energy development. So this is a satellite view of DFW from 1984. I'm just going to draw your attention to this northern band, particularly between Plano and McKinney up there, as well as between South Lake and Louisville. And we're just going to hop ahead to 2020 and back and back up. And to put this into larger landscape perspective between habitat loss for other reasons, as well as increasing urban development, we're really looking at some catastrophic effects on a lot of grassland obligates. So a lot of folks have seen this study. When it was originally published, it made a very big splash, as it well should, looking at what's happening to our birds in different ecosystems. This is not a contest you want to win, but unfortunately, grassland birds are in the steepest decline out of any considered ecosystem or clade. So we're looking at having lost 3 out of every 4 eastern meadowlarks since the 1970s. Which, as many times as I share that with people, I still feel that. And here in Texas, we're losing an estimated square mile of open space to development daily. And one of the more recent statistics I heard is every day Texas is acquiring, either through birth or immigration, 1,000 new people every day. That's a really incredible amount of population growth. And it's something that's going to put a lot of pressure on already very fragile ecosystems. And it also means in my role, I have to start thinking about what prairies are going to look like in a changing Texas and how to work effectively in conservation in a changing landscape. So I'm curious what the new Texas Land Trends report is going to say, because I suspect we're going to see some really interesting trends come out of particularly the pandemic years. But already by 2017, over half of our landowners were under 100 acres. I expect that's going to have gone way, way up as folks have left cities and were able to work remotely. So more and more folks on smaller parcels of land, which means with every small subdivided parcel, you then have a smaller core protected of that grassland and an increasing amount of vulnerable edge. And when you compound that further by the fact that now your neighbors might be more houses, a solar farm, a major highway, then you have a vector for invasive species and new pressures that we haven't really had to deal with on this scale before. And unfortunately, the smaller the parcel, the more vulnerable those species are to extirpation and eventually potentially extinction. But what's really concerning to me too, as somebody who loves this disturbance-dependent ecosystem, is how many folks in this room would be comfortable if somebody lit a fire next to their house? I would be, because I know exactly what it's going to do, but I'm very well educated when it comes to fire. So we're starting to lose some of those tools in the toolbox. Okay, I promise that was most of the heavy stuff. And I will tell you that as hard and stark as that truth is, and as really devastating it is to hear sometimes, and devastating to watch, there is hope still to save Texas prairies. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways that MPAT works in that field and some of the ways that you all can help me advocate for prairies. So MPAT is a lovely land trust that was started in 1986 because folks were concerned about the rapid disappearance of tallgrass prairie in the state. And our lovely mission is focused on the protection and restoration of prairies, as well as the education of Texans about why they should appreciate this awesome landscape and ecosystem that predominates the vast majority of the state. And naturally, as a prairie organization in a state that is almost entirely prairie, we work statewide, which is why my north and North Texas is particularly sticky and flexy. We are unique in that we are organized into local chapters. So I know a lot of you in this room are probably very well acquainted with some members of our Fort Worth chapter. Y'all are awesome, but you don't need to tell me that, you already know. But we also have chapters in Dallas, San Antonio, Fayette, Central Texas is slowly coming back, as well as Houston. And our members do a tremendous amount of work on their own and through chapter advocacy as well. So we're incredibly lucky to have them. Currently, we're very happy to protect over 5,000 acres on 27 properties. That number has gone up by 2 this year, so I'm very excited. And we do that through a variety of different tools, including conservation easements as well as acquisitions. But MPAT is also an unusual land trust in that we're willing to accept and manage properties. And there's a couple of reasons why we'll do that. So we will accept and manage prairies in part to protect that biodiversity into perpetuity because we know it's going to be safe. We're protecting that biodiversity and that seed source, but we also want to make them accessible to people, not in soft hiking trail sort of way, but in intentional outdoor education, intentional classroom. Absolutely. We also invite researchers out to do a variety of different projects. We actually had someone who found a wheatgrass variety that was put into an herbarium many, many years ago and happened to find it and knew that they needed a genetic diversity cultivar and actually contacted us to come out on our properties. And we do a variety of different things like that. So if you have research needs or folks that need places to do research, please have them contact me because that's something we're always engaging. But in addition to owning and opening those properties, we're always on the look for the golden ticket, which is prairie remnants. So there are areas in Texas that are fortunate enough to have never seen the plow and have not had significant soil disturbance, which means that they're supporting an incredible treasure trove of biodiversity and species that we likely can only find in small pockets. The reason why we have prairie remnants, particularly in North Texas, is actually an artifact of the folks that came to settle. So a lot of the Czech and German settlers set aside a hay meadow just in case. And I'm so grateful that they did, because they kept that hay meadow for just in case. And they taught their kids to keep that hay meadow for just in case, and their grandchildren for just in case. We're lucky enough that we can actually protect some fairly large remnants. And we actually ID our remnants mostly from plants and plant community and plant ecology. So there are certain plants that make me really excited when I go out to visit landowners, and they know right away because I start wiggling and, you know, staring at this plant and looking at it like it's my firstborn child. And usually they're as excited as I am, sometimes a little confused. But there's a lot of really cool things you can learn from plant communities, which is why I'm going to make this shameless plug. And I'm sure somebody looks familiar. For Prairie Seekers, which was a program designed, run, and developed, and is still amazingly run by our Fort Worth chapter, which is designed to train volunteers how to assess the condition of prairies and how to understand what's going on with the prairie ecosystem from plants. So if you too would like to be a plant detective and perhaps confuse some of your friends and or relatives by telling them exactly what's going on and why you're excited about certain plants, I absolutely adore this program. Next event will be November 11th. But the primary tool that we have in our toolbox as a land trust to conserve private lands is not to acquire them. In fact, that's fairly rare, and it's usually a somewhat difficult process. Land is expensive, so that's not a viable route. Usually we end up with properties that are left to us, which leaves us with this other tool, which is conservation easements. So this is by far the best fit for addressing how to conserve private lands in a predominantly private land state. And what it does is it allows me to work with landowners to say, hey, you love this prairie, let's make sure it's going to stay prairie into perpetuity. What we're going to do is legally bind it up. We're going to say that this property can no longer be developed, this property can no longer be subdivided forever. And the best part about it in a private land system is the land stays private, the landowner retains the title, they can leave it to whoever they wish to leave it to, they can continue their succession plan predominantly for working lands with a lot of folks that we talk to. And they can still manage and do exactly all the things that they have been doing to maintain a fantastic ecosystem. It's an absolutely fantastic tool. And if anyone in the room is interested in learning more about how that mechanism works, I'm always happy to talk about that as well. But supporting landowners overall, something that I think is incredibly important and something that we try to do an incredible amount of as an organization. So one of the things I do in my role is organize landowner workshops, because I want to make sure that folks that are even just casually interested in what they can do with native plants, either for the financial side of their operation or for the wildlife side, have absolutely every tool and every resource they could possibly ever need to make that happen. So I try to get as many great folks into the room to help folks understand what resources are available to them, what funding opportunities are available to them, where to get seed, how to select seed, anything that you can think of. And more I've been trying to work with different natural resources groups to build local communities that are focused around trying to do the best thing for their wildlife and also for their operations. Another way that we do this is through the Prairie Heritage Registration Program, which is eaten slightly by the Zoom. Because it is incredibly important for us, and me in particular, to recognize excellent prairie stewardship. There is a lot of hard work that goes into maintaining a disturbance-based ecosystem, as you can imagine. And it's incredibly important not only to recognize that hard work, but for folks to recognize and see that other people have done it, and they've done it really well. And it helps us build networks of those dedicated landowners. One thing that the program does as well is it connects you more and more to folks like myself, my network, and any sort of information I have at my disposal. And if I don't know an answer to something, I am very determined and will find the answer for you. And you get cool things like this awesome sign that has been designed, and you get your story published on the MPAT website, and we make a very big to-do about you because what you're doing is amazing. If you're interested in that, please let me know. I'm increasingly going out to visit folks that are interested in this process, and I also go help with management suggestions as well. So the other big part of MPAT's mission is restoration and increasingly habitat management, because we do own a considerable amount of prairies throughout the state. And what you're seeing is a property that we're very, very excited about from above. So that is Dow Ranch. It's 150 acres outside of Austin. It is our new headquarters. And it is the classic example of what I would expect to find if I were to go out and visit a random cattle grazing operation, which is that it's been grazed very, very hard for a very long time without a lot of time to rest. And they really love any blue stem that is not big, little, or meant to be in Texas. So we're in the process of restoring this property, which opens up a lot of really cool opportunities. We're really fortunate being the DFW Metroplex and also being in North Texas, because we actually have more access to prairie spaces and publicly accessible prairies than a lot of other parts of the state. Once you start hanging out in the Austin area, you realize that there's very few places to go, particularly very few large places that have prairie. And it's also seductively close to the capital. So there's definitely plans of using it for education and outreach for a variety of different ways. We're also using it as an education tool. So anything that we were doing out on the prairie to try and bring it back from that overgrazed state to a native oasis, we're documenting. We want folks to learn from what we're doing, learn from the process, and use us as a guidepost to do the same process themselves. But it's increasingly important that we advocate and help folks restore native rangeland in particular. Folks that are at least partially dependent, if not wholly dependent, on a cattle operation to make their livelihood have a really hard time. They're not really making the profit that folks, I think that they are, especially by the time you account for their time and their inputs, particularly with traditional grazing regimes where you stock heavy and you stock long. The more native rangeland we can get back into the state of Texas, the more we can support those producers, but also the greater wildlife benefits we're going to have and ecosystem service benefits we're going to have. And for anyone that is particularly proud of this part of their Texas heritage, you should really want to make sure that you have ecosystems that can support the continued persistence of this really cool animal. But the story in Texas isn't complete unless I also talk about how important urban systems are as well. Conservation and effective work in Texas requires the two-pronged approach. We absolutely need to conserve huge tracts of prairie systems while we still have them to conserve. But realistically, development is not going to stop. And it's important to advocate for prairies and urban spaces as well. And the reason is this: tremendous root systems that native grassland plants have Our typical turf grass plant has that itty bitty root system. Absolutely weeny by the time you compare it to some of the grass species we have, particularly tall grass prairies, big bluestem and switchgrass. As tall as they are above ground, they have as much below ground in root biomass. And some of the forests that we have get down to absolutely ridiculous depths, such as our compass plants. I'm talking 14 to 15 feet, which is awesome. And that root system means that prairies are really good at a couple of different really important functions, one of which is carbon sequestration. They're actually arguably better at it than forests because you can flip the equation on biomass. Forests put most of their biomass above ground. Prairies put as much, if not more, of their biomass in some cases below ground. So if we're looking at numbers for that, acre of prairie can store up to 5 tons of carbon. And if I could snap my fingers today and just freeze frame all of the native grasslands that we have remaining and just keep them, we would do so much good in terms of maintaining and sequestering carbon. I'm really excited, particularly on the restoration front, because there's an increasing movement and interest in carbon credits. So potentially we'll see more and more native plants going back in to do this important service. But the reason why I bring it up as part of urban needs is because we're realistically in a changing climate. And anything that we can do to encourage and try to slow that process, all the better. And we have a really effective tool sitting in our backyard. Perhaps a little bit closer to home, this was last year in August. This is the view of Dallas after it flooded. Upstream effects are going to be incredibly important for everyone that's living in DFW, especially as development pushes further and further north. Those rural landscapes, particularly those prairie landscapes, are capable of absorbing 9 inches per acre, which is at a phenomenal number because of that root system. And yes, they're going to hold way more water than your turf grass and your crop species as well. Your best bang for your buck to prevent your city from flooding is going to be strategic saving and working within watersheds of native species. And also important, especially in a state that has a heavy dependence on aquifers, that root system does an incredible service in helping retain that water in the soil, slow it down, and actually allowing your aquifers to recharge. It also helps reduce some of the sedimentation and pollutants in that as well. So really incredible services. And if you're somebody that likes to nickel and cent the value of that, just looking at what Texas Land Trusts have done, it's an estimated $1 billion benefit in ecosystem services in the state of Texas that is given to all of your taxpayers because we are maintaining those services by protecting that property, making sure it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And there's really important boots on the ground application in cities as well. Ultimately, cities are going to be hit really hard by increasing temperature. Urban heat island effect is going to be particularly nasty. Some estimates are 7 to 12 degrees higher with increasing temperature in cities. And there's been more and more work done by a fantastic group of folks down in Houston, in particular through TNC, showing that native plants planted in urban infrastructure as well as in urban parks actually helps cut that heat effect quite significantly. They're really good at helping cut that extra heat that comes from being in a city environment. It's also going to help again with that flooding from increasing impervious surfaces. And there's actually been really cool work that's been done in Dallas with TNC and a variety of other partners showing that green infrastructure not only works really, really well, but it's really cost effective. And they're using native grassland plants. And the other factor of this too is with increasing population in Texas, there's going to be increased pressure on water. That's something that is just unavoidable. What is avoidable is how we use water, particularly in the Metroplex. So a lot of the turf grass lawns that we have are tropical species with a tropical appetite for precipitation that we do not have in the state of Texas. They're really good alternatives that are native that won't require that. And for those of you that are not emotionally attached to your lawnmowers, also require a lot less time mowing. I say that because you never know who has a deep, committed relationship with the lawnmower. And I respect that. But also really important, particularly to me as I look towards the future as a relatively young professional in conservation, is this idea of sense of place. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the concept, it's the meanings and knowledge and bond that you form with a specific place. It's your sense of place. So if I were to randomly ask somebody in this room, I would likely get a very different idea of what it means to be from Texas or be from a specific area of Texas than if I were to ask somebody randomly on the street. In particular, I'm not going to expect them to say, hey, Texas is a prairie state, and did you know that we have this really cool state wildflower or this really cool insect relationship with this specific plant? I'm likely going to get complaints about the traffic, comments about the architecture, or things that are very, very urban, very human influenced. And I want to shift the paradigm. Because if you don't have a strong emotional connection to that ecosystem, you're not going to have a reason to value it, especially if you can't see it. And we know more and more, especially after the pandemic, there's a really deep desire for wild spaces in urban environments. Even before the pandemic, there was an increasing amount of studies saying that a lot of outdoor time that people get is in urban spaces. A lot of wild time people get, so not ballparks, is in urban spaces. And we all know in this room the mental health benefits that you get from being outside. I don't need to tell you that. But is that emotional connection that's going to be a really big difference of what happens in the future of Texas prairies? And again, preaching to the choir a little bit, but for folks that get involved in the stewardship, the exploration and the ownership and stewardship of those wild spaces, the deeper that emotional tie goes. Which is part of the reason I've been putting this little ditty together on the MPAT website with help from a lot of fantastic folks in this room, actually. But the publicly accessible Prairies map is part of the way I've been trying to get people to not only know where they can go out and find a prairie, but to engage more and try to encourage more wild spaces in their urban environments and use it also as an advocacy tool. And just to give you an idea of the scope of the need and want for this, before I could even get it up on the MPAT website, it already had hundreds of views because people were just finding it through Google. Now it's already almost up to 2,000 views and it hasn't even been up there for a full year. So there's a very big demand and want for these natural spaces, which makes me incredibly excited and hopeful. And speaking of wild spaces and prairie and urban environments, pocket prairies, absolutely fantastic tool and something that MPAT is trying more and more to support, endorse, provide information for, assist with where we can, particularly in Houston, where we have our education program. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into making pocket prairies so kids have outdoor classrooms right on their campus. And if this is something that you're interested in or have questions about how to get started, I'm always happy to talk about it. And if you want really awesome signs, there's a QR code on the table over there. And if you're not sure where to get started, one thing that MPAT has done in the past and is working towards more and more in the future is trying to make that as easily accessible as possible. So down in Houston, our Houston chapter with a variety of different partners, including Katy Prairie and the Coastal Prairie Partnership, put together the 9 Natives program. So some of the species aren't the best fit for North Texas, but it still gives you some good running guidelines for what might look aesthetically pleasing in an urban garden that's completely native. And there's a shade version as well. And I'm super excited that thanks to some of the members of our Fort Worth chapter, there's a collaborative team working on putting together a version of this for North Texas. Very excited about that. So here comes my second soapbox moment. I told you I was done. I wasn't quite done. As much as I want there to be 20 of me to show up to everyone's city council meetings and HOA meetings and show up to your place of worship being like, you have a really big lawn. How would you like to pay a lot less money to water it and also not have to mow it for this low entry cost of some seed packets and some elbow grease? This is where you can absolutely help us, particularly in urban spaces, and also advocating and telling your friends why those rural spaces are important to your lives here in the Metroplex. But perhaps the biggest conservation issue that I foresee in our future is going to be solar. So solar development is a congruent pressure that we already have to increasing urbanization. Unfortunately, in Texas, 33% of the solar is actually installed in farmland, which I can translate to as a significant amount of prairie land. So as much as we can advocate and remind folks that are in office, particularly at our local levels of governance, that we would like to see dual use structures, all the better. Currently, we're only seeing 2.5 of all solar installed in urban areas. And I don't know about you, but when I go grocery shopping, I would absolutely love if the whole place was covered in solar panels. I won't feel like I stepped into a convection oven when I'm coming out with my groceries for the week. And also it could generate enough power to power a single average home for several months, which is awesome and something we absolutely need to pivot to, in particular because, again, we're putting pressure on very precious and already imperiled systems. So some of you probably heard about the Smiley Woodfin Prairie, which was the largest tract of Blackland Prairie that we had remaining in the state. It is slated to still be developed partially for solar farm, but thankfully through work from TNC and the fact that the solar company is actually fairly environmentally thinking, a significant amount of that acreage was set aside. But for a long time, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. And that is the largest remaining tract of Blackland Prairie we have in the state. So it is going to happen very rapidly. It is happening very rapidly throughout the state. And the more that folks can help advocate that urban spaces is where those panels should be, all the better. So the long and short of it, large parcels of prairie are absolutely essential. We need to conserve as many of them as we possibly can through a combination of working with landowners to get things into easements so they can have working lands into perpetuity that are ideally are in native grasslands, but also to maintain biodiversity for the future generations that we have that will be in Texas and preserving those ecosystem functions that I mentioned. We absolutely need to increase restoration efforts. Realistically, we're looking at a lot of very hard hit grasslands. If we were to save just solely grasslands in the state, to get them back to the point where they're going to have the most benefit for wildlife, that means we need more restoration. And changing urban land use is absolutely critical. Anything we can do to remove barriers, particularly noxious weed rolls, all the better, because a lot of our native plants don't like to fit that very neat idea of what a manicured lawn should look like. They tend to get a little bit bigger than that and a little bit showier. So anything we can do to remove those barriers means that that flower is going to be there for some pollinator or for someone to develop that sense of place. That's going to be a really important stepping stone for mitigating climate change as well. And with that, I'm going to highlight some of the fun outside stuff we're going to be up to. So it was mentioned in the announcements, but Climber Prairie, we're going to be having a moth night out on the prairie on July 29th. So if you would like to come hang out with me and get really up close and personal with nocturnal insects, please let me know. Space is limited, but I still have slots open. So sign up or send me an email. And in the future, I'm going to be holding a bio blitz. Registration for that is not up yet, but it will be held on another Saturday in September out at Dixon Water Foundation. We'll be holding a landowner workshop in October. And there'll be another Prairie Seekers event in November as well. And I'm just going to casually pause here for some reason, in case anyone, for any reason, wants to come out and look at moths with me. National Moth Week is near and dear to my heart, in case you can't tell from the t-shirt. But it is an incredible citizen science effort, though national is kind of a misnomer at this point. It is absolutely global. So it is a chance to contribute some really cool data to a really big science project. And, you know, you get to see cool moths. Win-win. If you're not a member of NPAT, and I promise none of the Fort Worth members are planted in the audience, if they haven't convinced you yet, I'm hoping that I have, because you'll stay in touch with our upcoming events. You'll help us with our conservation mission. And I think we're really cool, but I'm a little biased. And with that, that is my contact information. I love emails. Send me random questions. It's awesome. And I am chasing chickens on INAT. I was going to do chasing prairie chickens, but chasing chickens was just too good of alliteration. So, and with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Candidate for the landowner that has their property put in the dumpster.
What is in it for? Okay, there's absolutely more value than just pure altruism to put your property into a conservation easement. There are financial incentives to do so. So ultimately, you can get some money paid to you for an easement. Typically, that's a little bit more competitive because it's going through grant programs. But in any way, shape, or form that you go, you do get tax deductions as well for your federal taxes. And that's not going to compete with your ag exemption or your wildlife exemption here in Texas. They're totally compatible. So there are financial reasons to do it as well.
Those events, if we want to attend those events you just had up, do we go to the texasprairie.org website?
Absolutely. So if you want to attend any of our events, texasprairie.org is a fantastic place to go. If you're not signed up for a newsletter yet or a member of NPAT, that's an even better place to go. But in the case of the moth event that's coming up on the 29th, anyone who's interested at this point is welcome to RSVP through the little QR code I put up, which will let me know that you're coming, or shoot me an email. But for the most part, yeah, absolutely watch our website. You can actually subscribe to our WordPress as well if that's more your style, and you'll get updates whenever we post something new.
Are there any questions from Zoom?
Yes. One question, and
Okay.
if you can repeat it after I ask you, is the Prairie Habitat Registration Program Texas specific?
Is the Prairie registration program Texas specific? Yes, it is, because it is an NPAT program. So we only cover the state of Texas. If you're interested in a habitat certification program that's not in the state of Texas, I could absolutely give you a bunch of different options depending on your interest. For example, there's monarch way stations and a variety of other programs, which by National Wildlife Federation, there's quite a few different options that aren't tied to the state. And by the way, all of these are totally stackable. You can hang our sign next to someone else's sign and we won't be offended.
Next question, is there a minimum acreage for conservation easement? For instance, can I get one for our suburban house on a quarter-acre lot?
That's going to be a tough sell, unfortunately. Ultimately, the cost for everyone involved to put a quarter acre in is probably going to be as much to put a 20-acre parcel in. So the likelihood you're going to find a land trust that would be willing to do that, unfortunately, is small. In that case, I would steer you towards the Prairie Heritage Certification Program or something similar to celebrate the hard work that you're doing. But unfortunately, we don't have tools for a quarter of an acre.
So what is the minimum?
It depends. I know that's a very helpful answer to the question of what is the minimum, but honestly, it depends. If you have prairie remnant, we're on it. That is our happy place. We're not going to be looking at how many acres you have if you're sitting on a remnant prairie. For most land trusts, and I'm including MPAT as well, some of our collaborators, that varies very widely. Some land trusts other than us will turn you down if you're less than a couple hundred acres. NPAT is much more flexible. So if you have ecosystem that needs protecting, particularly remnant or high quality prairie, we're a lot more flexible. We've protected stuff in the past as small as 4 acres. Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. That is a really good question, by the way. So the question was, what is MPAT doing to work with developers and different entities of that kind to essentially help them set property aside or do the best? Okay. Or convince or do outreach with different stakeholders like that. We're getting more and more started in that foray. We've had events like our People for Prairies event where we've actually deliberately started conversations like that and actually invited speakers from different industries to address that type of problem and that type of question. At this time, we don't have a deliberate program to reach out to them, but we do know and work with a variety of different industry partners. But it's something we're always looking to expand. Yes, ma'am. Where do prairie seekers meet? Well, the smart answer is on the prairie, as Kate just beat me to. But the long answer is it moves. And I will repeat, the Thompson Foundation in Montague County. And registration for that has not gone out yet, but that's pencil it on your calendar and keep an eye out.
Or you could be joining INPAD locally and you get our newsletter.
Absolutely. Join MPAT, join the local chapter. There's a lot of excellent folks in the Fort Worth chapter.
Shout out in the chat from someone who works at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and she said that in September they have an exhibition opening that focuses on texture.
We're actually planning to have some kind of an event. We don't know quite yet exactly what, but a special tour for INPAD or for INPAD and friends, you know.
Oh, that would be awesome. Thank you for sharing, by the way. Okay, that was a really epic stretch and not a question, I don't think. Yes, ma'am.
One of the needs that I see is to explain to cities the difference between mowed grass green space and actually preservation of native plants. I came across recently looking at a developer that was going to put property out there, and they claimed that this is green space. All that really is a bunch of grass that goes down to a water containment center. That isn't a good description of a green space. And what is the best management technique to try to explain that?
This is another question of trying to explain the difference between grass as green space and native green space is a depends question. It depends on your audience and who you're working with, because in some cases the closest and shortest path to your end goal is to tell them the cost savings that they would have not having to mow or water. And sometimes it is the emotional tie-in. So that is getting either other folks in your neighborhood or area involved, your Texas Master Naturalist and chapters involved, and advocating for the worth of that transition, whether that's your parks department or even just offering to adopt those spaces sometimes goes a really long way. And never underestimate emotional buy-in. For my work, when I go out and visit landowners, the reason why they want to conserve something or they want to restore something is not because of logic, it's because of emotion. It is because they know that they want to pass down their ranch to their great grandkids. It's because that they grew up pheasant hunting and they don't see pheasant anymore or quail, and they want to bring those back. In cases like that, in urban environments, I have conversations with folks. Well, what do you want your children and your grandchildren and your neighbors' kids to know? Do you want them to know what a monarch looks like? Do you want them to know what wildflowers look like? How can we use this space to make sure that that happens? But it depends. Yes, Kate.
The one thing you didn't mention, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious maybe as to why, is we all have a vote.
Yes.
And sometimes cities need to hear from, I mean, the developers have an incredible influence.
They do.
And they outweigh us money-wise, but we vote. And there's something to be done there. And it's not clear to me what, other than as individuals, we all go and vote, but does Impact not have any thoughts on,
Voting.
well, I'm sure it's, you can't just say go vote, you know, there's a,
Yes.
is that just not in our playbook? Encouraging people to vote in the right way?
Yes and no. As a nonprofit, we do have certain parameters that we're restricted within in terms of lobbying. But if I take this hat off for a minute, there's absolutely leverage and working particularly at local levels of governance to try and elicit those changes. Invite your local mayor and your local townspeople who are running your town or your county out to some of your projects, particularly if you're having events or you're having educational programs. Bring them out, show them why it's important, see if they'll advocate for it. It's a lot harder to determine upfront, particularly in smaller like local elections, who's going to be your green vote. But absolutely, yeah, that has influence. And in the case of particularly things like solar panels and solar installation, local governance and county governance is really going to make the make or break the difference for what happens in the state. And now I'm officially an MPAT employee again. Of course.
I got one more quick question.
Okay.
I got a chicken question for you.
Yes, my favorite. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
That's a prairie chicken. I've been panhandling 1997.
I'm jealous. Okay. Mhm.
I don't know what was more impressive, watching those crazy chickens do that dance, or watching the hail block comet come over our head.
Yep.
Trying to find that Heaven's Gate group behind them. Chickens they went out. They were impressive.
And for those of you that don't know what they look like, I usually sneak a picture in most of my presentations because I have to. For some reason, I didn't in this one. Is literally like evolution's left turn, and then they refuse to stop and ask for directions. Because
It's those male chickens that did that dance, isn't it?
it absolutely is. They have air sacs that they use to make noises without opening their mouths. They stamp their feet. And they have feathers that look like pigtails when they're down or bunny ears when they're up. I love them. Evolution's left-hand turn.
Thank you so much, Carly. Thank you. Somebody get the lights back on, and Josephine, if you'll bring me the tickets. Any announcements from the floor here? Well, we'll be, I'm gonna read ticket numbers for those folks who are here in person. We'll be back here the third Monday of October, which I say I get August and October confused. Those are the only 2 months I get confused. Of August, the third Monday of August, is it the 21st? We'll be right back here. We are scheduled to have Patrick Newman, who's the head honcho big boss of Brit and the Botanic Garden, we think, and he's formerly of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. I have it on very good authority that we have Amy Martin coming back in September. So everybody stay as cool as you can and have a great evening and a great week. And thank you again, Carly, very much. All right, ticket, I'm going to read the last 3 numerals, 833. If you have ticket number 833, go choose something on that table. Please get some snacks and drinks. 844, I did not plan that. So I've called 833 and 840.